Hi there, my name's Rose of Dawn and today I'm going to be talking about the recent NUS Trans Conference. Just what did they discuss and should we be concerned by anything they raised? Give it up, gonna be alright. In a previous video, I touched on how the trans community has been co-opted by people pushing a gender radical agenda and speaking over transsexuals who should really be at the heart of the community. I was told I was being ridiculous and misrepresenting the situation. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the agenda, that is, the literal agenda being set, at the NUS Trans Conference earlier in the week. This should be particularly representative, given they chose to separate themselves from the NUS LGBT conference back in 2016. Remember, identity politics doesn't cause factionalism and division, it brings you closer together by being separate. So how did this enlightened, tolerant and diverse conference go? The Twitter hashtag painted an interesting picture. Trans activists had taken over a women's bathroom and claimed it as gender neutral, to the chagrin of other guests in the hotel, one of whom openly challenged the gender radicals who stood guard outside. This sign was eventually removed, with some delegates blaming the border force, who were also staying in the venue, for removing the sign. Other delegates complained of rampant racism during the event, with one speaker making a joke about colonialism. Some were so upset they took to Twitter and asked for reparations in the form of pizza, cigarettes and money, providing their PayPal details so fellow conference goers could relieve their guilt. There was also a paranoia of gender-critical feminists infiltrating the hashtag used during the conference, and trans-masculine individuals were considered useless and reactionary, unlike the other delegates, of course. Given this is a trans conference, we should be seeing pure trans politics here, none of those naughty cis people adding completely unrelated topics into the agenda. I was told there is an agenda radical ideology that is being pushed in the community. So let's put aside my ridiculous previous hysteria about a radical ideology being pushed and taking over the community, and focus on the sensible, representative and democratic agenda of the NUS Trans Conference. I have previously stated there are 4 signifiers of the gender radical ideology. These are: there are many genders. Biological sex is a construct. Smash the binary. Don't assume someone's gender. And all of these are inevitably accompanied by hard left politics. So if I was wrong about the gender radicals, these points wouldn't have a place in the NUS Trans Conference. In the motions document, there are exactly 53 references to non-binary alone. The motions are ensuring that the many-gender aspect of the ideology is well enforced and takes up significant space. But maybe this is because, in their own words, the majority of the trans campaign's elected leadership is non-binary. This mirrors everything I've seen in trans spaces over the last few years. And they go on to congratulate themselves by saying, whilst non-binary people face specific oppressions in society, it should be applauded that they are well represented within the trans campaign. With this in mind, they don't need to safeguard non-binary representation, as they already have it. But despite this, you'll find many motions which state non-binary voices need to be heard within trans spaces. But there are no comments of this nature for trans men or trans women. The only focus is on the non-binaries. So this comes across as paranoia. In this community, the gender radicals are not the oppressed minority they claim to be. They are the colonising force. Throughout the motions, there is a complete disregard for any sort of gender binary. In motion 403, for example, the gender radicals completely tear down or smash the binary because they attempt to redefine what it means to be a woman. Their conference resolves to change the definition of women members with the members of the campaign who self-define partially and or fully as women, including, if they wish, those who include woman in their gender identity and those questioning whether their gender identity includes woman. The gender radical definition of woman was diluted before, but now it's more homeopathic. The motion is a blatant dolazoling of the category woman. Interestingly, in a conference in which the majority of the leadership say they are non-binary and therefore not women, they believe they have the right to say what a woman is, without asking a woman at all. But they only do this to women. Whilst they elaborate on the definitions of woman and non-binary, there is no such elaboration for men. As a further disregard for any binary institutions, there's plenty. They see men's and women's sports teams as unnecessary gender segregation. This isn't just a commentary on allowing trans men or women into sports that align with their gender. This is ending binary categories for sports because the gender radicals feel they are excluded. And remember how it was the women who had their own bathroom taken away and made inclusive for all? Well, except for women who just wanted their own space, of course. And the idea of not assuming someone's gender is also pushed within the conference, with an amendment stating, "The chair, steering committee and all other speakers shall not make any assumptions regarding the gender identity or pronouns of individual members. Any references to an unknown person must use gender-neutral language." In terms of denying biology, there weren't direct references, except to say content taught to medical students isn't adequate for trans people. I would agree there should be more education on this subject, but without any further elaboration, it's difficult to say whether this is a sincere attempt at helping to cater for trans men and women, or whether there's another agenda being pushed. But I should also highlight there are no motions which comment on the medical needs for trans men and women. As I previously discussed, accessing the right healthcare is essential for trans people. After all, what we have is a medical condition and not an ideology. I would have expected a motion which helps to provide assistance to people who are transitioning in higher education, helping point them in the right direction when trying to get healthcare. They do, however, comment on the high cost of changing documents such as passports and driver's licenses, which doesn't just affect those changing their gender, but anyone updating their details. They propose encouraging universities to offer financial assistance to students who wish to change the documents for transitioning purposes, which I can understand, but I don't think this should be the university's responsibility to finance document changes. As I said, these costs aren't just for trans people, so it feels unfair to only do it for them and not for anyone else. For example, if someone gets married and takes on their partner's surname. So having proven me right about the gender radical ideology, what did the NUS Trans Conference cover? This conference had split off from the LGBT conference so it could specifically focus on trans issues. Asexuality turned up in 2 of their motions. With no disrespect to asexual people, it's questionable enough in an LGB conference, but it has no connection to trans people at all. This is nothing but virtue signalling. Unless, of course, you consider the way asexuality is now forced to be a spectrum that includes people who are fine with sex. The same way trans is now full of people who are fine with their gender. Another priority for the trans conference? The abolition of prisons. So a community that claims to be at constant risk of harassment, violence and even murder has now decided to advocate against punishing these individuals, replacing it with restorative justice. They also said it's been suggested that a non-binary prison should be opened in Scotland. This seems unnecessary, as I don't think any of these people would self-define as guilty. It should go without saying that advocating for the abolition of prisons has nothing to do with being trans. And the motion, which encourages LGBT societies to run workshops with their members to learn more about prison abolition and restorative justice, is mandating a hard left agenda. In case you need clarification, this is the transsexual versus gender radical argument. Trans policy would be to let trans women go into women's prisons provided they've transitioned enough. Gender radical policy is just abolish the prisons. That's not trans politics, that is a hard left ideology. And speaking of which, the most worrying motion, the thing that should get this conference investigated by universities, Motion 202, always anti-fascist. In short, Motion 202 calls for the funding of political violence on and off campus in order to combat speech they perceive to be potentially harmful. It's a long motion and dissecting all its flaws would make the video far too long, so I'm going to hit on the key points. This isn't a motion combating homophobia or transphobia, but it cynically says those aren't problems, it's the fascists that are. So LGBT people saying there is homophobia or transphobia within minority communities, for example, are now being explicitly labelled as fascist enablers. The motion also endorses the no platforming of speakers they find problematic. This is a common tactic used in universities across the UK, but when you look at some of the targets that have been chosen, including Julie Bindel, Kate Smithwaite and Sargon of Akkad, a mixed-race centre left liberal, None of these fit the definition of fascist. These are not people inciting hatred or calling for violence, which, by the way, is exactly what this motion calls for. This motion does not condemn political violence and threat. It only condemns fascism, because the gender radicals are absolutely fine with violence, provided they're the ones doing it, no matter how many innocent people are hurt by their remarkable inability to even identify fascists. Let's be explicit. They put forward an anti-fascist motion not because fascism is a threat, or that they hate political violence or intolerance, but because they are violent far-left radicals. They are not only condoning political violence on and off campus, they're calling for more of it. And they want university students to fund it. Of course, any delegate can propose a motion and have it seconded, and the beauty of a democratic conference is that amongst this diversity of thought and opinion, the overall saner convention will rationally debate and dismiss extreme and unrelated ideas, allowing a saner policy to prevail. Except every single one of these passed. It's easy to point out how ridiculous this conference was. Like, really easy. Seriously easy. But they did have some motions I would agree with. For example, motion 204 mentioned the fetishization of trans people, which is sadly a real thing, and encourages more sex education for LGBT people, and is also inclusive of disabled people. It also touches on the more extreme side of sex, including chemsex, and education on the subject is important. But I would love to know your thoughts on this conference. Do you agree with the motions that they passed? Or do you have some concerns about what they discussed? Please let me know in the comments. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and you can now follow me on Twitter. Thanks again, I'll see you all next time.